Hey, do you want to make an impact in your career? Find something that hasn't been explained yet and pour your passion into explaining it. That's exactly what James Joule did on his road to entropy. Hi, I'm Bob Hanlon. I'm here to talk about James Joule today and the power of his curiosity in guiding him on this path. Let's review the key milestones on the road to entropy. Back in May, I had a video about the early steam engines that came out of England, Thomas Newcomen and James Watt. In June, Phil Hoskins shared about the rise of the high-pressure steam engine. Then in July, I spoke about Sadi Carnot and his analysis of the steam engine. Today, I want to talk about James Joule and his discovery of work-heat equivalence. Who was James Joule? Well, he was a brewer in Manchester, England. He worked hard, very industrious, from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. each day. But at 6 p.m., he turned towards his passion, which was science. Separately, around 1830, the electric motor arrived in England. It was all the rage upon arrival. Joule was looking at the electric motor eventually for use in his brewery. He wanted to know if it could replace the steam engine. So he began tinkering with the electric setup. And thus began a very unplanned journey. And the true scientist in Joule came out during this journey. What did the Tinkerine look like? Well, he had a battery, a voltaic cell, generated an electric current. Eventually, he sent it through a resistor that happened to be in a water bath. What happened? Wow, the water heated. Well, as we know now, this is to be expected. If you put a flow of charged particles through a set of stationary charged particles, you're going to get an increase in motion and heating. But back in the 1800s, they didn't know this. What was thought to be known at the time was the caloric theory of heat. And what that said was that caloric is conserved. So if heat or caloric appears in the water bath, where did it come from? It can't simply appear out of nothing. Was it flowing along with the electricity from the battery? This is the question Joule was wondering. So then Joule said, let's get rid of the battery. If I get rid of the battery, will that get rid of the heat? Well, how did he get rid of the battery? Well, Joule realized that because this setup works in this direction, again, you got a battery, electric current, he also knew that that current could spin a magnet, and that magnet could do work by lifting a weight. He said if that works in that direction, then it must work in the opposite direction, meaning that if you do work to spin the magnet, you can also get an electric current. So how did he do that? Well, he did a new setup without the battery by doing work using a hand crank. He actually sat there and spun a magnet to generate the current to send electricity through the resistor into the water bath. Well, the water still heated, which ruled out the battery as the source of the heat. So now what's causing the heating? This set Joule to wondering even more. So he said, well, let's make the apparatus even more scientifically sound. Let's substitute for the hand crank a falling weight, which is what he did. So he used the falling weight to spin the magnet to generate the current to go through the resistor in the water bath. This gave him a much more quantifiable and repeatable source of work. So he started to do many different experiments, many additional experiments. I can't go into all the details here, but eventually it dawned on Joule, as you'll realize from the previous slide, that he started to see a connection, an inherent connection between a falling weight, which was work, and the rise in water temperature, which was heat. So then he said, well, what's the simplest definitive experiment I can do to demonstrate this connection between work and heat? So he set about designing the simplest apparatus he could that would demonstrate and quantify this very unexpected connection between heat and work. He basically had a weight on a pulley. He let the weight drop on the pulley, which spun a paddle inside a water bath, and then it warmed the water. In the caloric theory again, the heat is conserved and cannot be generated in this way. Well, Joule showed otherwise. He said effectively that if you had a 772-pound weight and dropped it 1 foot in this apparatus, you would raise the temperature of 1 pound of water by 1 degree of Fahrenheit. This became known as the mechanical equivalent of heat. There were two reasons why this was such a big deal, and you're going to see a lot of exclamation marks on this slide. The first reason why it was such a big deal was that work and heat weren't even supposed to be connected with each other. They were in entirely different realms of science at that time. It was thought to be impossible to heat water by agitating it. Well, Joule's work provided Rudolf Clausius with the path to energy in the first law of thermodynamics. That's why this was such a big deal. I'm going to talk about this a month from now in another video. The other reason why this was such a big deal was that the accuracy of Joules' experimental work was simply amazing. He was trying to measure a temperature rise of about 1/2 degree, and the challenges here were huge. I don't want to go into all of the details of that, but basically he had to reduce all friction and all heat losses to 0 to achieve this result. How difficult was this? Well, back in 1995, Heinz Otto Sibim attempted to repeat Joules' work. I highly encourage reading his paper. The one sentence I wanted to share with you now was this: when we entered the room in order to read the temperature, the thermometers responded immediately to our body radiation. Wow, talk about experimental challenges. When Joule died, a tombstone was put at his grave that looked like this, and I had to share this with you because it's just fascinating. At the top of the tombstone, you'll see the number 772.55. This was the mechanical equivalent of heat that Joule measured in his experiments. It was later upgraded to 778 with further research. The other thing that I wanted to show on this tombstone was the quote from the Bible. The quote read, "I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work." This so applied to Joule. He was extremely industrious and accomplished much. In reviewing the key milestones on the road to entropy, I covered Joule here today on the work-heat equivalence. Next month I'm going to talk about Rudolf Clausius and how he united the work of Joule with the work of Sadi Carnot to come up with the first law of thermodynamics. But before I go here, I want to end with one moral of Joule's story. The moral is this, and it ties back to how I started this presentation. Professor Carl Carlson, a theoretical physicist, once said, "Poking at small effects you can't explain can be a way of unraveling a much bigger piece of physics." This is exactly what James Joule did. I go into the full details of James Joule and his work in my book, Block by Block, The Historical and Theoretical Foundations of Thermodynamics. In the reading about Joule, you'll realize that I view Joule as a true scientist in pursuit of truth. A wonderful story. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation here today. Goodbye.